All right, welcome to the Impartial Skeptic. My name is Mark. Please like and subscribe and share. So, today we're going to talk about Paul. We're also going to talk a little bit about Peter. It's hard to talk about Paul without talking about Peter. Um, the thing I learned growing up as a Catholic was Peter and Paul were like brothers in Christ. And you know, lockstep and everything else. But I'm going to tell a little different story because they really weren't. I mean, they didn't. The thing is that Peter was never the head of the church. First of all, somewhere along the line, even though Peter was the um, leader of the church in Jesus's eyes during his life, he was his right hand man and everything else, and he was the rock and all that kind of stuff, the rock of the church. Somehow, after the resurrection, James becomes the leader of the church. Somehow, ironically, and uh, and Peter is his right hand man. So interesting that, and I have some theories about that as well, and it all kind of plays into this whole thing I want to talk about today. So now let's go to so we know that. Well, Peter ends up becoming, because we always learned that he was the head of the church, but what they really say is that he was the first bishop of Rome, which is actually true. But the first bishop of Jerusalem, or the first bishop of the church, would have been James, the brother of Jesus, and that somehow he took power, and Peter was fine with it. But I'm going to also kind of show you where Peter is a bit of a wishy-washy person. I mean, we kind of know that from the you'll deny me three times before the you know before the crow. Uh, anyway, that's the way Peter was, and I think he continued that for the rest of his life. Ultimately, I believe that Peter ended up becoming more of a disciple of Paul than the other way around. Paul's a pretty strong character, no matter whatever you think of Paul. Now, I think he's a nut personally, but he was a very strong character. So anyway, Saul of Tarsus, later known as the Apostle Paul, self-appointed apostle, by the way. He never knew Jesus in his lifetime that we know of. He never says that he did. He claims his superiority by knowing him in the spiritual sense, having seen visions of him, rather than having known him in his personal life, like the apostles and Peter and James, who he opposed, interestingly. So, um, Saul was a devout Pharisee, well versed in Jewish traditions and laws, and he was a student of Gamaliel. Gamaliel, however you pronounce it, I always forget. It was a very respected, very well known rabbi. Anyway, Saul had his little experience, as we know, on the way to Damascus. He was there when they persecuted Stephen. He had letters from various Jewish leaders to persecute the Christian churches because he believed that they were impure of the Jewish faith, and they threatened the purity of the Jewish faith. Even though James, who was the leader of the church, and in fact, all the apostles were practicing Jews, but James actually served in the temple as one of the temple priests. Um, Not sure how they come to that, but how he could be, the leader of that can be a temple priest, and then there's people are being persecuted. I don't know how that works, but anyway, that was the case. So Saul, I think, was responsible for a lot of deaths of basically fellow Jews, because most of the Christians in the area were Jewish at the time and practiced. Most of them practiced um, the law of the Torah. Um, So he's in the desert, and he is struck off his horse, and he has this vision. Well, there's a few theories about that, and I have kind of a mix of the two. One is that he's really feels pretty guilty about all the people he's killed or had killed. He may not have personally participated, but he definitely was. pointing them out and dragging women and as well as men out into the street to be, taken away. He was like a Nazi. He was like a Gestapo. But anyway, so he has this vision. He struck off his horse in the desert on the way to Damascus. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what time of year it is. Is it really hot out? Is he having, is he low on water? Also, there's evidence that he was an epileptic. He had these like visions and stuff like that throughout his life. And in fact, epileptics will often, there are some that believe that actually like portions of their seizures and that they feel ecstasy and enlightenment and all this other stuff. So, and sometimes kind of like almost a religious experience. So, um, and there's some science behind that actually too. But so there's a possibility, and a lot of people have talked about that he may have been an epileptic. And I think coupled with the guilt that he felt, that he probably, probably had some temporary blindness. It could have been from the sun in the desert. It could have been from the epileptic seizure. It could have been a combination. And with his guilt and everything else, and then being taken I think he was taken to a Christian's house. If the story's even true, I mean, we're just going on the fact if it's true. So he was, and because this is the one guy we know existed, and we have actual, not maybe not actual letters, but we know, letters that he's written. We know you know, where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we don't, those are just assigned. Some of them, the Gospels are assigned. So we don't know if they're who the real authors are. As one of my commenters had pointed out, which yes, I know that if you study this stuff long enough, everybody knows that. In fact, a lot of pastors agree with that too. A lot of don't though. It's like I know a lot of Christians that just it's they were the apostles, and that's can't tell them anything different. So anyway, so Paul changes his mind, becomes a Christian. All right. So for whatever reason, and now he eventually goes to seek an audience with the Jerusalem church, and does, and meets them and everything else. They're a little reluctant at first, obviously, but they get and then he's basically given the task of going to the Gentiles. So he goes to the Gentiles. He goes to various churches in Corinth and Antioch and various places, and helps set up churches, and starts teaching his views on which he believes are superior, because his views, and he appoints himself the 13th apostle, and he bitterly calls the ones that knew Jesus in the flesh as the super apostles. And he claims himself superior to them because he knew Jesus in the spiritual form, whereas they knew him in the flesh. Although if he had risen from the dead like they say that he did, they would know him in the spiritual form as well, I would think. Although he did have his body, but I don't know. I don't know how he makes this distinction, but I think he's a little crazy, personally. That's just my opinion. I know if you believe in all this stuff, you would obviously, you know, think that I'm an idiot, and that he actually had these visions. But I don't, I think that he, like I said, that he had a lot of guilt. But anyway, so he claims this superiority over them because of his knowing Jesus in the not in the body, but in the flesh, or in the spiritual realm, basically. In the I forget how he puts it. So ultimately, Peter or Paul is at Antioch. Fast forward a little bit, and well, I'm not sure which happens first. In Acts 10, it talks about Peter having had a dream that that he can eat lizards and all kinds of stuff, that it was okay. All right, so he has this dream and he talks about it to somebody, and I don't know if that's something that was just made up and thrown out there. at the end, but probably not. He probably had this dream, and then it was before he went to Antioch because so he goes to Antioch anyway. I don't we don't know the time. Nobody knows the timeline and when the Jerusalem Council took place. There's no. It's hard to know. We have the letter of Galatians, which where Peter talks or Paul talks about um, the incident at Antioch, and then there's some possible mention of it in Acts, which kind of smooths it over a little bit. But Acts has a tendency to do that with Paul, because if you read Acts, you'll see that Luke, who may have been the physician Luke, who was a disciple of actually of Paul's, was a um, wrote Acts, and if you see, it starts off talking about Peter and some of these other apostles and stuff like that, but then once they introduce Paul, it all becomes about Paul. You'll notice that if you when you read Acts, it's like two-thirds of it or something like that is all Paul. So anyway, um, Peter comes to Antioch, and he's hanging out and eating with the Gentiles and the uncircumcised. And in Galatians, Paul calls Peter out, calls him a hypocrite, basically, for being with the Gentiles, presumably after this dream he had. So he's with eating with the Gentiles and everything, and then a contingent from James comes from Jerusalem, and suddenly he goes back to not eating with the Gentiles, because you weren't allowed to eat with Gentiles if you were Jewish, and that's what I was saying. Most of the apostles were Jewish, and well, they all were the 12, and actually, so was Saul, and eventually Saul started, saying no, they don't have to abide by this stuff. They're not Jewish, so that's what the Jerusalem Council ended up being about. And they ended up giving in to Paul. They ended up giving him saying, yeah, okay, that they can go ahead and they don't have to follow all the rules, and but we wanted to think about these things and whatnot, and they allowed it. So that allowed the Gentiles to be part of the but the Christian church. But that all came about probably because of the Antioch situation, and um, I mean, and that's why they were there in the first place. They were there to check on them. It's like, are you doing the right things? And so then they were called in, and they gave their side, and James eventually came out and said that they were allowed to do it. Now, there is speculation that um, him doing that, James doing that, was what got him killed, what got him stoned to death. He was actually thrown from the temple wall, and then wasn't dead, but then stoned to death on the ground below. But some believe that somebody had died or was recalled. I can't remember what the story is. I'll have to look that up eventually. I always forget all the details. But anyway, he was the person who was left in charge had the vendetta out for him and had him executed. And I think it was the same. It was the son of the person who had his brother executed, I think. But anyway, get into that later. It's not important for the story. But anyway, so he's that was in like 62. But anyway, so James has kind of has doesn't agree with Paul, but he gives in. Peter, he kind of goes back and forth. He's it depends on he's a go along with the crowd kind of guy, seems like. But here's the thing: eventually, um, they end up in Rome together, Paul and Peter. Now, if you read Clement, um, in the Apostolic Fathers, Clement says that basically that they were kind of in lockstep. So I think once they were in Rome, um, they probably did collaborate, and Paul, with his bull-like personality, um, just bowled over Peter with his wishy-washy personality, and Peter probably started believing more of what Paul said and became his apostle. So that's why Peter was never going to lead the church, because he just didn't have the, I don't know, he kind of went with who he was with. I've heard of people like that. They will agree with the last person they talk to, kind of thing. Easily influenced, I guess. I don't know. So that's the way I kind of see the situation happening, and I could be wrong about that. I mean, obviously, because nobody really knows for sure. But that's what's kind of interesting and fun about this, is that there's just limited information. Until we get more information, there's a lot of speculation involved in trying to figure out what happened. I mean, even some of these authors like Bart Ehrman, I mean, they have some pretty good evidence, but it's not set in stone necessarily, because there's limited writings. I mean, we have this pretty much, and then there's some, it's like Josephus. People believe that those are added. The things about Jesus and James were added to Josephus, which is entirely possible. They were adding stuff to the Bible, like I pointed out in the last two videos that I did here. But anyway, so that's kind of an introduction to Paul and Peter, and their little fight, and what I believe happened with Peter becoming more on the lines of Paul, um, and less on the lines of James, especially as James was out of the picture at that point. I don't think I'm not sure if he was dead yet, but when Peter first went to Rome, but he was definitely, not in his company. So as we saw in Antioch, when Peter went to Antioch, all of a sudden he's eating, with the Gentiles and eating God knows what. And then Peter's or Paul or James's entourage shows up, and suddenly, nope, I'm out. Goes back to the eating with the Jews. So anyway, um, please like and subscribe. The subscribe button is going to be right there, and then there's going to be a video right here, which would be probably my last video. Anyway, have a good day.